Well, when I saw him play the first time, I was like, oh shit, that guy's in a band? Because, Axl was just notorious troublemaker. He was like a little rock guy you'd see in a fist fight at a club over a speed deal. I was like, this is genius, man.
After hours at the Burgundy Room. How's everybody doing? I'm Zach Selwyn. There's a word in the dictionary that's impresario. It's defined as an organizer, a manager, a producer, a promoter, a publicist, a showman. And our guest tonight has worn just about all of these hats, and quite possibly a few dozen more. He's a self-professed rock and roll jack of all trades. This gentleman has worked with everyone from the Sex Pistols to the White Stripes to Beck, Soundgarden to St. Vincent. All this in between signing rock stars, marrying movie stars. He's also happened to own some of the most incredible swinging bars and restaurants in Los Angeles. He was a key figure in the new era of bars and restaurants that took over Hollywood in the late 80s and early 90s. I want to give a big after hours welcome to a true rock and roll journeyman, Mr. Jon Sidel. How you doing, John?
I'm good.
You're a very interesting guy. Your name, your reputation is all over this town. The first thing I knew about you was, he owns the restaurant Dominick's. Then I found out you were an A&R guy at V2 Records. Then I heard you own Smalls, which is just a legendary place that I heard stories about. Everywhere I go, there's a Jon Sidel story. You kind of just got to LA and took over. You're from Manhattan originally? Is that right?
Yeah. What we would call the East Side.
What was the first moment you were like, wow, this city's electric with music. I got this bug. I want to be involved in music.
It was New Year's Eve, 1969, watching the fireworks over Central Park and realizing that the 60s were over. I, for one, was feeling like I missed the 60s, so, I might as well try to make my own fucking 60s right now. That's kind of what happened. I was like in pottery class at age 6 singing Light My Fire. That was just my kid. That was just me. We used to have like late night live concerts on TV. And I saw the New York Dolls play on Don Kirshner's rock concert. And it was sort of like the Rolling Stones meets David Bowie. I had gone on a teen tour trip to England. And the kids there like David Bowie. And so I saw that the New York Dolls were playing. I went down to go see them at Max's Kansas City. And it was the club, actually, that was the attraction. From that moment on, at age 14, I was obsessed by clubs. But I had some main heroes that I really looked up to. Dennis Hopper in the movie Easy Rider is definitely the standout. The way the rednecks drove up to him in the truck and he flipped them off. That was sort of the way I envisioned my life would be, to be a guy like that. When the man drove up to me, I'd be just flipping him off. Also, Jim Morrison, John Lennon. My number one guy in high school was easily Joe Strummer and The Clash.
I grew up in a small little town in the desert. I didn't get concerts. I didn't get to see The Clash or, anyone even close. You're in New York City. I mean, these guys are right around the corner from where you live.
In my mind, I call New York in the 70s, do anything you want, Phil. This legendary club Studio 54, I always wondered why I could get in and all these like suckers would be left outside and they wouldn't let them in. And then I realized many years later it was because I was a 15-year-old boy and they like 15-year-old boys. I just thought because I was so cool.
Andy Warhol would like to have a table with you, young boy. So was the club the first thing you wanted to get into? You saw how much money these guys are making, and you're like, you know what?
Oh, it had nothing to do with money.
Okay.
And that was the last thing. I was one of those people, I read the rock magazines and I believed everything, like as a kid. So when the Sex Pistols said no future, I assumed I had no future. So there was no money to be made. It was just art to be made. And if I was a good artist or I could play guitar, I would have been in a band or been a painter. In fact, I had tried to do those things, but I remember making money at a certain point, but that was never my motivation.
Interesting. I mean, an artist's life is a commitment. I mean, you got to do it all in, which is why The Clash, you're like, these four guys, they don't give a fuck. There's an element of risque behavior. You're like, these guys are going to die.
There was a lot of very risky behavior that I had for many, many years, but I never thought of myself as really an artist. Like, I realized I was good at a few things, but they were products of not being able to do the things I wanted to do, like be in a band or be an artist. Although I still did them anyway because I was taught that was what you're supposed to do. Like, don't be a pussy, make some kind of art. You know, that was other people who I looked up to just told me to do that. So I did.
You also got to hang out with a lot of these rock stars, a lot of your heroes. You mentioned David Bowie earlier. Isn't there some story about you in a men's room covered in David Bowie's spit?
I met David Bowie over a course of a week, a couple times. And it's not easy in some ways to meet your rock and roll heroes. It's usually disappointing. I was standing there and David Bowie is shit-faced out of his mind. And he's literally like poking me in my shoulder saying, man, you own this restaurant. You're the fucking coolest guy I've met, man. You're fucking my hero. And I'm standing there going like, this is not really happening. This is like, David Bowie's not saying this to me. I can't, you know, he's there with a mon and he's all drunk off his ass. And so I didn't know what to say. I just remembered having to leave the table. And the Olive, I don't know if anyone had ever been there. It was a very small restaurant. There wasn't really anywhere to go. So I went to the bathroom to just sort of get away from David Bowie losing it on me. And I looked in the mirror and I saw this gleam and I looked down and I realized in those days I only wore all leather. And I looked down and David Bowie's spit was all over me. I looked at the faucet and I thought, okay, I'm going to clean this off. And then I thought about it for a second. I said, fuck it. And I just rubbed it into my leathers. So I still have Bowie spit in my leathers. And then I did see him later. He had done a movie with my wife. We'd run into him occasionally.
When did you get to LA?
I came to LA originally in the fall of 1980. Then I came back in the summer of 89.
Where'd you go to school?
I graduated from UCLA.
You're probably hanging more in the college club scene around LA. You're not necessarily venturing out into Hollywood and seeing what's going on out here? Or was
No, there was no college club scene.
Well, our college dive bar, you know.
There was no dive bar in colleges. A friend of mine who I met in college, older brother, had a club, one night a week club, and it was the closest thing to New York. It was actually the first rap club in LA. And I met people in that scene.
Which club is this we're talking about?
It was called the Rhythm Lounge.
Now, is this where like the dudes from Delicious Vinyl and all those guys kind of came out of?
Well, one of them, yeah. The one who was ended up being my business partner was the DJ. He was the DJ. Ice-T was the rapper. They needed to have graffiti paintings, and they didn't have anyone to do the graffiti paintings. And since I was from New York, I was the default guy to do the graffiti paintings. I'd stand next to the paintings, hopefully a chick would come by and I could talk to her and tell her I did the painting,
Suddenly you're the artist you always wanted to be.
That's how I got into the club scene. At first
How interesting. I mean, and now for those of you who don't realize, hip-hop in LA came up a little later, obviously, than in the Bronx and Manhattan and anywhere in New York. And I was a kid, I was in love with rap music, and I would watch Ice-T and I'd be like, that's the hardest dude I've ever seen in my life. And he was wearing like leather suspenders and all this kind of like stuff, imitating the East Coast kind of guys. Now, of course, hip-hop's everywhere. But at the time, that was the first hip-hop club in LA, and there you are going there in college. Are you starting to think in your head, wow, I could really do some business out here if I brought what I know from the New York scene into LA? I
was more motivated by like, hey, maybe I could use this club to meet like a cute chick on campus. They had this thing in New York. This is going to sound really ridiculous and blunt, but they had this thing where they had velvet ropes and there would be a guy outside, we know it as a doorman, not letting someone in and like kind of sweating them. So I convinced the guy to buy the velvet ropes and let me stand out there and be the doorman of his club. And my motivation was to like pick off that chick, if I could.
I mean, women are an incredible motivation for a lot of people in this business.
So if you see me waiting outside of Velvet Ropes, it's my bad karma because it wasn't my idea, but it was all my fault.
It's a great idea to just bring a velvet rope everywhere you go and just put it out front and be like, how you doing, ladies?
I'll never forget, this guy is a very old friend, but he's in his French accent, like, dude, I don't understand. Like, why would you not let someone into the club? I was like, trust me, man, it works. It works in New York. You don't let them in. They want to come in a lot more.
So you basically created the velvet rope scene in Los Angeles. I'm gonna say that.
I imported it.
You imported it,
but right? I did, yeah.
You got here in '89. What was your first club you actually got involved in, or restaurant, or whatever?
No, I came back in '89. Right. But I was involved in big clubs in LA before then.
Okay.
The biggest club I was involved with was in '85.
What was that club?
It was called Power Tools.
Big club, downtown LA?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was one night a week. It was big. It was fun, hectic.
And you're partying a lot then. I mean, you're young.
Yeah, I was partying a lot.
You're throwing it down. So you're involved in that. Then you went back to the city, New York. And then what made you come back out here?
It was a weird time in New York, and I was dating a girl from New York who lived out here. And so I came back out to hang out. And in that month, I bought a bar. I had tried to buy a bar before I left. It wasn't a new concept, but it wasn't easy to figure out back then. It was a little harder in the 80s to buy a bar.
So what bar is this?
Well,
What was
the one
it?
that worked was Smalls. The first one I bought was an old 50s bar called Lane's, but that one I couldn't get permitted and I lost my ass. But we learned enough information, Sean McPherson and I, to buy the second one. We bought this gay motorcycle bar called Griff's, which ended up being Smalls.
So Smalls takes off. What year do you start seeing like, wow, I have a hot place in Hollywood?
Oh, years before then. I mean, none of these places in LA were anything like the club I had in New York, but I mean, I was used to this kind of shit. I was doing it I was in the club scene for years.
Well, let's go
before
back to New
Smalls.
York then. During what club are you talking about in New York that you're involved in? And like,
I was involved in a club called, I'm sorry to be so confusing, but
It's all good.
First I was involved in these rap clubs, and then I owned Power Tools, which was
Power Tools,
pretty
of
much
course.
the most massive one that I had. And I had like two other ones, and then I had one in Texas, Power Tools in Texas. And then I went to New York to do a nightclub for these guys who owned Indochine, which was a very hot restaurant at that time in 87. That's when I met Tommy. Tommy, who's here.
yes,
Burgundy,
one of
with
the
us.
producers of After Hours at the Burgundy Room.
That was like, in my opinion, like nothing in LA could be comparable to something like that in New York. But looking back on it in hindsight, Smalls was more fun, but the other one was New York in the 80s.
Can you kind of explain how we go from buying bars, promoting, and all that sort of thing into becoming an A&R guy?
Basically, I just burned out on being at bars and clubs. It had been like 10 years of just being at a bar. And when I started to understand Joe Blow was an A&R guy and understand there was that position at a record label, I thought those guys just wanted to be in a band. So sounds like a cool job, but I should just be in a band. I mean, so I tried doing that. I think we succeeded to at least my capabilities. If I was more talented, maybe we would have been a bigger band, but I just...
What's the name of the band that you formed?
Fudge Factory Incorporated.
FF Inc., of course.
FF Inc. The name is uncomfortable.
Almost
I
like
wish
Power
I
Tools.
wish I had said I would have thought of it, but I didn't. I was trying to be anti-self-centered, so someone else thought of it. You know, I started thinking, hey, man, these guys, I could do that. I could pick out a band better than these. These guys aren't that cool, these particular A&R people, X, Y, and Z. No one in particular comes to mind. There was a guy who was a big-time manager at the time who used to like to hang out at my bar in the back room and do a lot of drugs. He got in my head, like, you knew Guns N' Roses before anyone. Why don't you bring in some bands? And he had me meet with some people at labels, and I brought some bands, and not much happened except for the bands that I brought in. One of them became pretty big, and so I was like, okay, I want to be in the music business. I couldn't really figure out how to get into the music business, so I just started signing bands. And I partnered up with a guy who had a coffee house, because I had Swingers, this coffee shop, and this other guy had a coffee house in Seattle, but he somehow hustled a distribution deal and got a little funding from a friend. So we just decided to partner our resources, and I signed 2 bands and he signed a few bands.
Wow.
So I basically just offered someone a deal. Funny enough, A&R guy at another label at Geffen Records played this indie artist from Canada, and I tried to sign him. I was in Toronto, and a bidding war broke out, and like this guy was like, hey, have you heard of this guy, Jon Sidel? And everyone was saying, yeah, of course we know John. There's this restaurant, that restaurant. And from that, I ended up getting offered a job. And I also, that's one of the reasons why I sold all my bars, which was really not a smart move, but I felt like I needed to do that to have people take me seriously. So I sold all of my bars and restaurants and stakes in that. And then I got offered a job, actually an imprint, which was part of Geffen Records. That was Outpost.
Now, Outpost at one point put out a Whiskey Town record.
Yeah, and the fun thing about Whiskey Town, at the time, Ryan Adams was so drunk all the time and young and very kind of, he always needed a babysitter for the label, so I got to babysit him. I remember one time I went to Westwood One radio station with the band, and OG Whiskey Town.
Yeah, he lives up in my neighborhood. That guy jogs by me every once in a
Really?
while. I'm like, yeah.
We had dinner, he was at Keith Morris's birthday, it was a few years ago. It was fun.
Let's roll back to the Guns N' Roses story. You knew them before they got popular?
Oh yeah.
just through the club scene or through a late night scene?
Well, when I saw him play the first time, I was like, oh shit, that guy's in a band? Because, Axl was just notorious troublemaker. He was like a little rock guy you'd see in a fist fight at a club over a speed deal. I was like, this is genius, man. With Axl, there's 3 Axls. There's Axl number 1, there's Axl number 2, and there's Axl number 3. One of those 3 really likes me a lot and likes to hang out with me. So I've hung out with one of those Axls. I was just recently the publisher for Matt Sorum and Duff. I see a bunch of those guys around. I haven't seen Axl in a long time, but I see Blah Blah around. Gilby I know well.
Yeah.
Izzy I haven't seen around in a long time.
No one's seen him. Let's talk just real quickly about some of the bars and restaurants that you had. I mean, I know you said Swingers. We mentioned Dominick's. We know about Smalls. You were involved with Jones on
the rock
Santa
and roll
Monica across
jump.
from Formosa.
Yeah.
Another one of my favorite venues. And then the Good Luck Bar.
Yeah.
Crazy. That's a lot of places.
Yeah,
I've probably somehow been responsible for paying your mortgage like 3 or 4 times.
No, I never made much money on any of those places, to be honest. I had gone through a period of time where I thought I had lost my mind. Tried to check into an insane asylum. Doctor said, come back tomorrow, tell me how you feel. I went wandering around town and I found myself in this junk shop and there was this giant Chinese letter. So I bought it off of this junk person. He told me that the symbol meant good luck. I always wanted to do a Chinese theme bar. Matt Dyke and I used to talk about this, like what it would be like at one of those like seedy places in Vietnam during the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
like,
right. From Full Metal Jacket with Me Love You Long Time kind of thing.
Yeah, we wanted to do like a go-go dancer place with chicks dancing. That was like a place in Saigon.
That's what the Good Luck Bar was.
That's what it was.
It seems like the Smalls back room was pretty legendary. You mentioned that, you kind of got your start in A&R then, and I've heard some stories through some of our mutual friends. Are there any other great like moments you remember of like some people partying back there?
Well, yeah, there was actually a lot of them. I mean, the most memorable to me, a couple of nights I hung out with Paul Westerberg, and he like picked up my guitar, and we would just be partying, and he'd be singing me songs and stuff. Dave Gahan from Dave Mode, Anton and I with the it's too long.
Was that when Gahan was going through his like
I can't
growing
really
his
talk
hair
about
long?
it. I think it might be a little bit risque, but K-Rock, the radio station, rented out Smalls for a contest for 106 people to meet Dave Mode. And we weren't exactly Dave Mode fans, put it that way. But our friend used to work for Anton Corbijn and was on this photo shoot out in the desert. I think it's a famous photo shoot, and became friends
Not the
with
Joshua Tree.
Yeah. So Dave, my friend, and I, we ended up kind of tying one on in my office, and then they call him over for the party, which at least super fans really wanting to meet him.
We love you, Dave.
And it was a really weird moment for him. He was just
interesting, because I remember I was never a Depeche Mode guy either. Synth pop and all that never got to me. But you read that Gahan had a dark side, and for him to come out of like an office after partying till whatever time in the morning.
No, this was like 5 p.m.
No.
This was not late. This was
3 a.m. So he comes out of there and there's like a gaggle of 18 to 22-year-old super fans who want him to sign his "People Are People."
It was something out of like a zombie
t-
film because they
right.
were all just like wanted to touch him and talk to him, and we had just been like hanging out, just like getting wasted in the middle of the afternoon in my office.
That's awesome.
I'll tell you one other small story, which was like comes to mind. Joe Strummer, I had mentioned him earlier. Mm-hmm. He used to spend time in L.A., and when he did, I mean, he was easily like the most popular of all the rock stars, and there was a lot of rock stars to come through. The guy had an elephant's memory. He could remember everyone's name, not only every single person, but he would remember what their lives were like and what their wives were named or their girlfriends were named and like what they were doing with their life. And he was completely interested in everyone, including the parking lot attendant. And it was very exciting to all of us to be his friend and to spend time with him there. And the fact that he loved Smalls and us, all of us, not just John or me or whatever. So we're with him. It was all the usual crew, Tony's Monster crew, Chili Peppers. I remember Flea being there, and we're hanging with Joe. And the Buzzcocks walk in, Pete Shelley and Steve Diggle. And we're just like, oh my God, this is amazing. We're here with the Clash and the Buzzcocks. We're just like in heaven. And it was a really crowd. It was like a weekend, if I remember. And at some point, everyone's partying, and then someone just like points like, look, mate, like the end of the bar. And Paul Cook from the Sex Pistols was having a drink at the end of the bar. And I remember Strummer was like, cookie, cookie, cookie.
Oh
and
my God.
Grabs them, and next thing you know, we're hanging out with the Buzzcocks, Sex Pistols, and Clash at Smalls. And everybody was just like in heaven. We just thought that was, to me, it couldn't really get cooler for our gen to have all those people kind of like converge. So
Wow, that's phenomenal.
that
Cooler
was
than
just
that.
like an average night. You know, it was
that
like,
was a Tuesday.
No, for some reason it was a weekend, which was bizarre. Like normally you don't think of weekends being cool at a place like Smalls, but there was so many nights like that, so many different people hanging out.
You mentioned David Bowie. I know you're a big fan. I know he spit on you. Very exciting. What'd you think of that Lady Gaga David Bowie tribute?
In my mind, the whole thing was just irresponsible. I don't really blame Gaga as much as I do the Grammys. It's just like not the appropriate person.
What are you working on now, man?
I'm doing a bunch of stuff as usual. Working on doing a new publishing entity, more of a publishing service, digital rights management company. I'm doing that in conjunction with a boutique company right now called Lip Sync, and I'm looking for more alliances. You know, I still do what you'd call a podcast. I call it a radio hour. I sort of riff on the FM DJs of old. I like to kind of back announce stuff and create little slogans, but I do claim that it's a mix of obscure vinyl and new vinyl from the cooler artists that come out. You know, and it's fun and it's good to be out there. So it sort of maybe takes the place of me standing on the ropes, letting people in.
I'm going to run just through a list of artists. These are guys that Mr. Sidel here has either signed or considered a client. Start with the White Stripes.
My boss and I signed them.
Amazing. You're responsible for discovering one of the more genius minds of, I think, the last 20 years.
And I wouldn't say I discovered him. That would be Long Gone John. I sort of like saying discovering a band, sort of like saying you discovered the American Indians. I do think that my enthusiasm had a lot to do with the signing, because when I saw Jack White play, I was like very moved.
Fantastic. Next, let's go to Weezer.
I had worked with Rivers recently, and I've known him for a little while, but I got to know him a little more. I have to say, he was one of the more interesting artists that I worked around, and I really appreciated his process for writing songs. And I thought the album he did was awesome.
Black Keys.
I signed for a recording deal, ex-North America. I never met them. I still have never met them. Someone called me up on the phone. They said Black Keys, and I said, I'll take them.
I like
they
the
were
name.
like, how can you say that? I said, I'm good at what I do.
All right, the Strokes.
The Strokes, I was their publisher recently. I really enjoyed working with them. They're more family than a lot of the other bands. You'd be surprised, but I haven't really gotten to know Fabrizio, and I just briefly met Nikolai, but the other three I got to know pretty well. So it was fun.
What about Soundgarden?
It's funny, I saw Chris the other day. I went by and saw him at the studio. I don't even think he knew that I was his publisher. In fact, when I walked into the room, he looked at me and looked at Brendan O'Brien and said, oh yeah, I do know that guy. A lot of people who know me don't really remember who I am until they see me, because when you're a touring artist like that, like when you're a rock star, so many people are coming at you. But working in the capacity of Soundgarden's publisher was kind of a bummer, because it just showed how corporate rock management and big music company business just kind of shits on the artist's
True
songs.
artists.
Not so much the artists. They're rich, they tour, they're whatever. They've accepted that fact. Maybe they're even a little cynical. Their managers handle it or whatever. But just their songs, you know.
How about Beck?
I was his A&R guy for Midnight Vultures.
Oh, the greatest. That
admire.
Midnight Vultures concert, one of my top 5 ever at the Greek Theater.
Yeah, I mean, my
was
response
ridiculous.
to Beck was like, look, Beck, you don't really want to know what's going on here. Just be Beck. You'll be still doing this long after we're all gone. But sometimes I'll be in someone's office and I'll see someone has a platinum record from Midnight Vultures, and my skin just crawls. It felt like I took a couple of bullets on that one. But it was great to have gotten to work around him. And I actually ran into him on a flight fairly recently, and I was delighted that he won the Grammy. That was an amazing win for cool music.
You've seen everybody. Who's the best live performer you've ever seen?
I'm going to give my number one to Pete Townsend.
Have you seen, well, when's the last time The Who played?
I saw him play at the Hollywood Bowl fairly recently, and he was playing like strats and stuff, but nothing like when I saw him in the mid-'70s. That was like insane.
What about the best overall band?
Live?
Yeah.
The Who, easily.
Same,
With
okay.
Keith Moon, yes.
And then what's your greatest single concert experience?
Again, the Who with Keith Moon. There's been some other really noteworthy ones. You know, I actually saw the Elvis show at Madison Square Garden.
Wow.
But I was a little bit too young to remember it. Clash, first time they played in the U.S., was another show that I saw. In fact, okay, I'm going to brag. If you look at the London Calling album and you see Paul Simeon smashing his bass, I was so close to him when he smashed that bass that the shards of the bass went in my eyes, man. It was like, you know, the paint shards from the
That's
bass.
phenomenal.
I was like in the front row.
You're involved in that.
I was literally right there.
Kind of a touchy subject, maybe not. You got sober in the early 90s and you've been sober for 25 years. What was the moment that you remember you're like, I got to clean this up?
There was a moment where I was sick. I was dope sick behind Olive in the parking lot. And someone walked out of the restaurant and was just kind of straight. And they looked at me. And I had that moment where I was like, oh, man. But I wasn't like a rock bottom. I didn't lose anything. I just kind of burnt out. I was just miserable. And then when I got sober, clean, I was crazy. I just realized, man, if I'm that crazy when I'm not getting high, I just figured I wouldn't do it. Plus, I lost my taste for so many things. Booze, weed, pills. I just kind of felt like I'll cash in all my party chips. And so I just kind of refrained from going back to it. But I should say I am a sober member of AA, and that's been fun. More people I know from back in the day are sober than getting fucked up. So in a way, I'm proud of it, but I'm also not too cocky either.
Sure. Real fast, and this is a story I heard from he always has some great stories. One of them was the night River Phoenix passed away. Something went down right after that happened, where one of your regulars at Smalls ran into the club and started telling everybody this story. Were you there, or do you know what I'm talking about?
I wasn't there. It was a terrible thing that happened, but I don't really have a comment about that. But I knew River when he was a kid. He wasn't allowed in the bar. We were pretty strict because he was famous about him coming into the bar because we were afraid that we'd get a ticket and lose our license. So he would hang out in the parking lot at Smalls. But by that time I was sober, and I remember the night because it was a Halloween night and we almost went. A lot of people were hanging out at the Viper Room, but we weren't there. But that's another podcast. You got to find out.
Whole another episode.
You got to find out from the person who was there. But it's a shame. It's always a shame. There's a lot of people that have OD'd, for lack of a better word.
Jon Sidel, thank you for joining us, man. Like I said earlier in this show, everywhere I've gone, I've heard a Jon Sidel story, and now I've heard some from the horse's mouth, and they were even better than the ones that people have been telling me. And we hope you are enjoying hanging out with us here after hours at the Burgundy Room in Hollywood. And of course, hit the subscribe button, become an after hours regular, and never miss out on an episode. Also, leave a review on iTunes. We absolutely love that. Once again, I want to thank my guest tonight, Jon Sidel. Until next week, I'm Zach Selwyn, and I just wish Smalls was open right now because I'm gonna go hit that up.